Hello, you're listening to an interview with Amber Athey from episode 23 of the Catholic Vote Radio Hour. Like and subscribe to the Catholic Vote Radio Hour on YouTube, iTunes, and Google Play, and follow us at Catholic Vote on Facebook and Twitter. I'm your host, Stephen Harriott. And now I'm joined by Amber Athey, who is a rising star at the Daily Caller and has written columns for Catholic Vote as well. First of all, thank you very much. Great to have you back, Amber.
Thanks for having me on, Stephen.
Well, I've been following you at the Daily Caller and on social media. Your coverage of the gun control debate has been stellar. So I reached out to you, and I really would love to hear your thoughts, mostly on what the heck is going on with the CNN town hall and the increasingly scary rhetoric I'm hearing, mostly from the left, but I will say both sides, about the gun control debate.
Yeah, I mean, we've really gotten to this place on establishment media networks where we're really only hearing the anti-gun, gun control side of the argument. And we've seen that from their coverage ever since the shooting first happened, where every single student that they brought on was in support of gun control, which isn't that surprising that a lot of these students would be in support of it because they just went through a really horrific shooting. And I don't fault them for that. But there have been a number of other people who have talked about either the need for perhaps more school security guards, arming teachers who are willing to do concealed carry classes. There was a student specifically on MSNBC who said he didn't believe banning guns was the answer.
Right.
And shockingly, none of these people with opposing opinions have been given any voice, the networks, to share that side of the debate. And CNN's town hall last night was just another extension of that, where you literally had a room of 5,000 people who were all in support of gun control versus first Senator Marco Rubio and then NRA spokeswoman Dana Lash. And unfortunately, what happened wasn't a conversation. It was an opportunity for people who are very broken and dealing with a lot of grief to vent at people who had nothing to do with the shooting.
Right. That's a great way of putting it. It was not a conversation, and I'm not seeing any conversation going on, at least in establishment media. The Trump listening session was a little bit more constructive, perhaps, but of course that was also, I'm sure, rigged to some degree in favor of the Trump administration, so as not to embarrass it too badly. But and I don't blame either side. But the problem with the CNN quote-unquote debate or town hall, and with most coverage of this, is that it's not about a conversation about solving problems, and it's not even meant to stop mass shootings. It is basically a one-sided scream fest about implementing a series of policies that the left wanted anyway, regardless of the mass shooting. And they're basically saying, oh, we are going to do a bunch of publicity events and publicity stunts to ram down everyone's throat how furious we are and how much we want this policy. The other significant thing here is that the policies they're advocating for are increasingly baldly anti-gun and anti-gun culture in a way that's just not going to fly in the U.S.
Exactly. Or there are policies that actually already exist. For example, universal background checks. The only time that you wouldn't be background checked for a gun is during a private purchase. So it's rather amazing to me that the debate has basically turned into, if you don't support my policy that is blatantly anti-gun and probably infringes on the Second Amendment, or if you don't support my policy that actually already exists and is written into law but isn't necessarily enforced by the federal government, then you hate children and you want them to die. And unfortunately, this is a common talking point of the left that we've seen over the past couple of years, where every single issue that the right disagrees with them on, they've turned it into, well, you just hate kids. I mean, look at what happened with the healthcare debate. When Jimmy Kimmel's son went into surgery, he accused the GOP of not caring about children if they didn't support universal healthcare. So it's a common talking point, obviously not an accurate one, but one that's guaranteed to stir up emotions. So when you have a mass shooting like this, and people are brought together all on the same side of the political spectrum and they're able to use that argument, it just makes people angrier. It doesn't really get any closer to solving the underlying issues.
Right. Well, it makes me kind of angry. And some of my contacts have actually, and you mentioned this on Twitter as well, people have literally reached out and said, I'm joining the NRA, which I never intended to do because this stuff scares me.
Yeah,
because the rhetoric is, I was saying recently, the conversation goes like this. First of all, the onus is on you. Why do you need guns? Is they demand. Like, why would you ever need guns? And what is wrong with you, basically? Well, the answer is to resist tyranny. And they say, well, that's ridiculous and paranoid. And you say, well, and you say something about the NRA, and then ultimately they devolve into, well, you're an accomplice to murder. You literally have blood on your hands. You deserve to be shot by a firing squad. And I want federal officers to take away your guns. And you're like, well, did you hear me just mention tyranny? That sounds kind of tyrannical.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And David French of National Review actually had a really good tweet about this too, where he talked about the fact that gun owners don't fancy themselves as these people who are going to lead a mass resistance against the government anyway. They see themselves as the good guy with the gun, the people who are going to be around when something bad happens, and hopefully they can save lives. They view themselves in much of the way that a police officer or a firefighter views themselves in terms of helping the public. And so when you go out and scream at them and tell them that they're murderers and that they're evil people, it has exactly the opposite of the intended effect and makes them much more likely to double down on their gun ownership. And that's exactly what I pointed out on my Twitter, was that people were watching the CNN town hall last night. They heard people cheering for banning all semi-automatic firearms, which would be the vast majority of guns in America.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. I happen to go to a gun range, and my I shouldn't feel nervous. This is the other thing. Why do I feel nervous telling you on the air that I have a gun? I shouldn't.
Right. But it's crazy.
But yeah, they're all semi-automatic, virtually. I mean, that's basically all guns now. It's just the way modern guns are made. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And so when people heard that, they thought, well, I own a semi-automatic gun. Why would they want to take that away from me? I'm not mentally ill. I'm not evil. And so they hear that and they think, well, who is going to stand up for me? Who's going to protect my Second Amendment rights? And the common answer to that question, whether you agree with them on every policy issue or not, is the NRA. So I had people contacting me last night because they know that I'm politically involved in journalism or whatever. And they said, you know what, I've had enough of this. This scares me. I don't want my guns taken away. I'm joining the NRA. And some of them even followed up and sent me their membership receipts. So I went ahead and tweeted it out. And amazingly, I've gotten probably a dozen more people DMing me on Twitter, letting me know that they had also joined and sending me their membership receipts. And I'm only one person with not that large of a following, so I can only imagine if you looked at the NRA's numbers since this gun control hysteria has broken out, how much they've gained in their membership.
Right. CNN and others on the left are demanding something that they know will never be implemented. The effect that it's having, nonetheless, is to really stir up a lot of resentment and really divide Americans. And it's really, really unpleasant. It doesn't do any good. They know that they're not going to get their policy prescriptions implemented because they're absolutely just completely incompatible with American culture, I think. But at the same time, they're making people hate each other.
Yeah.
And they're making most ordinary Americans, they're making people that are in their court, they're trying to make ordinary, decent, liberal people think of their fellow Americans as horrible people motivated by this sort of demonic love of child killing. It's so bad.
It's really sad. And, I think it's really interesting that CNN has been talking about the fact that Russia was trying to cause division in our country with their social media campaigns. And yet the vast majority of their airtime over the past week was bent on demonizing gun owners, creating the same type of division that they claim to despise. And my colleague Peter Hasson wrote about this in the Daily Caller, a really great opinion piece about how the media is basically lying to the survivors of the school shooting and essentially using them to push a message that they've always believed in, but don't always have the necessary tragedy in order to use the emotional argument to push people to support it. And you mentioned the fact that they know that they're never going to implement a lot of these policies, and they're basically lying to these kids and telling them that if they go to enough town halls, if they do enough CNN interviews, that all of a sudden the 8 million members of the NRA are going to budge on whether or not you can ban semi-automatic weapons. And it's not going to happen. And these children are really set up for a huge disappointment. And it's sad to me that this is going to be their first experience with the political process, is fighting this losing battle against gun owners in America and being prodded along by cable news instead of getting the necessary counseling and help that they need after a tragedy like the one that they experienced.
Right. Well, I was just talking with Bobby Lopez, my other guest, about how I think the left generally likes to work using terms of urgent morality and emotion. And those are not inherently bad things. As tactics, they're incredibly effective. particularly with young people. I think young people are most likely to be inspired and motivated and moved by urgent moral language and emotional responses to injustice. And that's why the left tends to do very well, and it tends to attract a lot of young people. But the thing is, I think that the right and the pro-gun side of this debate should be doing the same thing. And to her credit, Dana Lash did that fairly well. And I loved that you wrote up her mention of Kimberly Corbin's story. As a very young girl, she was raped. It was horrible. And afterwards, she became a Second Amendment advocate and went around giving talks about women should carry and they should be able to defend themselves. When Dana brought that story up, she got resounding boos from the hand-selected audience at the CNN town hall. In other words, leftist activists hated the idea of women defending themselves from rape with guns.
Right.
What?
It was absurd and really disheartening. As a woman who chooses to own a firearm and, prays that I never have to use it ever, to hear that people think it's apparently disgusting or boo-worthy to want to defend yourself any way possible against someone who wants to hurt you, that's not pro-woman. I don't understand what exactly their argument was. And as some people on Twitter were saying to me that they thought it was a deflection from Dana, I don't see how it could be any more relevant to talk about the people who defend themselves with firearms, who use their right to self-defense. That's a huge reason why we have the Second Amendment, is for people to be able to defend themselves when the government can't be there. So to hear them boo that, I think was just a further extension of the underlying truth that a lot of these people really just want to repeal the Second Amendment. They're very dishonest about what their true intentions are. So they start with things like bump stocks and assault rifles or whatever made up term that they use to describe guns. But the reality is that, yes, people from the left want to take guns away from people. And I don't think that's an exaggeration at all. And if you watch SE Cup on HLN, she actually did a great segment on this the other night. She put videos of people saying, well, I don't want to take away your guns, versus the same person saying that they wanted to take away your guns. So it's a very dishonest starting point for the debate, which is why Marco Rubio, the one thing he did right last night was getting the crowd to admit that they wanted to get rid of all semi-automatic weapons.
Right. And he kind of stumbled into that. But you're right. Yeah, he did. I mean, when he mentioned we can't do such and such because that would create the problem of having to confiscate all of the semi-automatic weapons. And everyone's like, yeah, that sounds great. We want that. Like,
right.
What is wrong? And it's important to distinguish, by the way, between the nutty crowd of vengeful, merciless activists at CNN and the people they hand selected. Those people are not representative of almost anybody. That's a far left, horrible crowd of people that want to hurt and punish their fellow Americans. Most liberals don't have anything in common with them. And I think that they're eventually going to turn off more and more ordinary people who happen to be liberal. They like to pretend they have more influence and power than they do. But as Jesse Kelly recently pointed out, we need to stop pretending that CNN and Washington Post is journalism. They're just not journalists. Right. They're left-wing activists. They're communication arm of the Democratic Party, and they hate us.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. And I've pointed out, Brooke Baldwin has been on CNN the past week. Every time she comes on TV now, it's grilling someone about why they don't support gun control. That's not journalism. That's activism. There's an obvious difference there. And the common talking point is that the NRA gets its power because of its money. As we know, the NRA is not even in the top 10 of groups that donate politically. They get their power from their members. They get their power from the fact that millions of people in the United States support Second Amendment rights. Millions of people in the United States choose to own firearms for self-defense, hunting, sport, whatever reason they may choose. And you're exactly right when you say that the crowd at CNN was not representative of America. It's much more accurate to say that people who support the Second Amendment are representative of real America.
Yeah, or even if they aren't in support of it, they're also not going to call me a murderer for being in support of it.
Right, or yell burn her.
They're just not. Yeah, thank you for your perspective also, by the way, because you are a woman and a gun owner, and so is my wife. I was actually responding recently to Jessica Valenti, who's a feminist author, who said, the fact that Dana Lash brought up guns as a means to prevent rape is disgusting, in all caps, she said. And I just said, it's disturbing how infuriated you are that my wife is entitled to disagree with you and has a right to carry guns to defend herself. And the thought of how little you respect women like my wife and like Amber Athey makes my blood boil. That's so offensive to me.
Right.
So anyway, that's par for the course with feminists, unfortunately, in my opinion. But
yeah, I agree. And it's really sad to me that they love to talk about empowering women to make their own choices, but somehow we're not allowed to choose to own a firearm if we think that it could keep us safe. I live alone in a large city. So when I am sleeping at night, I want to make sure that there's a way that I can protect myself if, God forbid, someone decides to break into my home. I don't think that's a ridiculous fear to have, and I don't understand why anyone wouldn't want to have the tools necessary to be able to fight back if that were to ever happen to them. And I think part of the reason why feminists are so reluctant to admit that is because they like to view women as directly equal to men, even though we're different in a lot of ways. And I know for a fact that if a man ever attacked me, it would be really difficult for me to fight him off with just my body. So firearms they level the playing field for a lot of women. And it's crazy to me that feminists who talk about women's choices are not willing to offer women that very powerful choice.
Amen. Well, that was a truly Catholic take, and CC leftist Catholics, if you're listening, have some, be merciful and listen. So, all right. Well, thank you again, Amber. This has really been a great analysis by you, and listeners, do follow Amber. She's been especially on fire lately, and she's definitely a rising star, or maybe an already risen one. You can find her online at Amber_Athey on Twitter, and I do recommend it's a great follow. So thank you, Amber, and I look forward to having you on again soon.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, thanks for listening to this interview from episode 23 of the Catholic Vote Radio Hour. Again, you can like and subscribe to the Catholic Vote Radio Hour on YouTube, iTunes, and Google Play, and don't miss the rest of this episode coming Friday. I'm your host, Stephen Harriott.